All right, so this last critique is going to look at some areas where we can have some improvements. So this first image, I won't go over everyone's name for this, but this one's by Emmett, and I just want to say his name because his other two images were phenomenal, where he was really looking at the lines here, and we didn't talk about this image, but he had this great image for texture and repetition, and then he has this image for his shape image, and we see the shape, right? We see the shape of the parking structure, and we see how it's kind of interrupted by these ivy coming up, and that works well. But we're also getting interrupted by a red building in the background, and we're getting interrupted by the light post in the foreground. So this is really important in the image, but you're asking us to look past that. So I think this has happened for a lot of students where you see what you want us to get from your image, but oftentimes it's interrupted by things. There's other objects that are fighting for the attention of your subject. So here I would think, get closer. Let us just see part of this building. We don't need to see all of this detail. So simplify your image, take out anything that could be distracting. And I see this again in this image where we have the flag in the background. That's a great use of line, but it's on top of or behind a window. So we're getting the reflection of the window. Now the reflection of the window can be a really fun element to use and to add depth and add another narrative to your image. But if the reflection isn't telling us anything, it just becomes a distraction. It takes us away from looking at the actual objects. And I saw this in a few other images with light, how we have the texture that's really interesting over here, or even down in this area. But the brightest area is back here. So my eye is going to constantly go to that brightest area. And when that happens, I stop looking at the texture down here. I'm distracted by looking up here at these highlights. So make sure as you're photographing that you're watching where the light is telling the viewer to look. Watch where your lines are telling the viewer to look, and watch where the light is telling the viewer to look. And then these next are just some technical issues. So we had a lot of images that were shot with longer shutter speeds. Here we're at 0.5 seconds that weren't on a tripod, or maybe you were on a tripod, but you jarred your camera a little bit as you were photographing. So this is when you would want to always be set up on a tripod, use a remote to trigger your camera if you have it, and if you don't, just use a timer so that you click your camera, it settles down, and then your photograph is taken, because we don't want to see any movement here. We see this at 0.5 seconds. This is at 0.8 seconds. This is a really fun image for shape, for line. But if it's not sharp, it doesn't work. And here at 0.8 seconds, it's not sharp. We had a few images, I'll look at 3 of them, that had white subjects. But if you photograph something that's white, and then you just photograph it where your meter tells you to, it's always going to be underexposed because your camera wants to make it middle gray. So when you're photographing something white or something with a light background, you're probably going to need to overexpose it. Maybe here, I lost my mouse there. Maybe here you need to overexpose it. Sorry about this. So here you need to overexpose it about 2/3 of a stop in order to have a proper exposure. Or again, here we see that this is a white subject, but if we look at the histogram, we can see the right, I don't know, 1/8 of the histogram isn't being used, and that's where most of this image should be sitting, is on that right side of the histogram. So whenever you're photographing something white, as we see here, or dark, as we saw here and we saw here, make sure that you're overexposing or underexposing. And the best way to do that is to bracket, to make sure that you're getting that shot that's a couple stops overexposed, 1/3 of a stop overexposed, 2/3 of a stop, however you want to bracket it in order to make sure you get proper exposure. And then the last thing I want to point out is I think we can all recognize that Kim's been turning in really exceptional images for the last few modules. And if you just take a look at her contact sheets, you can see how much time she's spending on her assignments, that she's out there photographing a lot of different objects. And you guys don't need to turn in 3 contact sheets. There's no reason for that. But as she does this, we can see how many different subjects she's photographing and the different approaches she's taking to all of her images. And the more you guys photograph, the more you experiment, the better images you're going to have.